If you think about this aircraft flying for 5, 6, 7 decades, the pilots that pilot this haven't probably even been born yet.
This is the Tempest. Or is it?
This is just one potential concept, what it might look like. It's to describe a vision more than anything else. It's to put something tangible in people's minds as to what the Tempest future fighter might look like. That's undefined yet. This might be a smaller aircraft, it might be a bigger aircraft, it might have loyal wingmen of unmanned air vehicles alongside it whenever it's sent into theatre. That we don't fully know what it will look like, but we know that in 2040 onwards, we will have an emerging and enhancing threat that we need to develop technologies and capabilities to really overcome. So the pilot might be flying this aircraft, which will be the central aircraft, and then there might be smaller, less costly unmanned air vehicles flying alongside him, which could act as decoys. He'll be able to fly those, but they'll be much smaller, less capable aircraft, and this will be the centre capability which he will fly.
Since 2003, the Typhoon has been at the forefront of RAF operations. But in 15 years' time, the Tempest will take over and bring with it a whole new generation of weapons.
The environment's changing, and the threat's changing, and therefore we are looking at laser-directed energy weapons. They're around and about on the ships. There's other countries invested in them as well. But what we are taking a role on Tempest with our partners is to actually try and integrate them onto an air platform. So this would be the first fast jet with a laser-directed energy weapon on it. The threat of the future, and the threat of now actually, is very low-cost, cheap weapons that are sort of offensive weapons to us. So therefore, it's a great defensive mechanism as well for a future air platform.
And what can it do that a missile can't?
It's incredibly accurate. The details of which I can't say, but it can be incredibly accurate.
We're looking at everything from within flight systems areas, we're looking at battery technologies and using a lot less hydraulics. In the cockpit, we're looking at using augmented reality and virtual reality and trying to take a lot of the hardware away from that cockpit environment, and that serves two purposes. It allows very quick, upgradable software approaches, and it takes away weight and it takes away cost. And it allows the pilot to do a lot more. And that might be that he might be engaged with the unmanned aircraft that fly alongside this in a system of systems. And we're working on strategies to understand how there is a manned-unmanned teaming arrangement that says when does the pilot take control of an unmanned air vehicle and when does it let it make its own decision. We will always want a pilot in the centre of that, and we will always want to make sure that he's in control. However, we're looking at autonomous systems that can switch on and switch off different activities for the pilot, and we're using things like psychophysiological monitoring of the pilot. So we're trying to determine, without the pilot needing to tell us from his biometrics, how might he be becoming overloaded, and at that point we might take activities away from him, and that's a real area of focus, because you need to make sure that there's a real robust approach to that. We're obviously exploring stealth capabilities on the aircraft, flexible payload bays, because the future of weapons could look very different to what they look like today. So we're looking at options to have flexible payload bays, have different missiles all contained within it. We've got to do this in timescales that support Typhoon going out of service, which means that we've got to do this in half the time. So when we get to a key milestone, which is 2025, where we go through a final investment decision, we'll have 10 years to get this into service. And that's a real challenge. And we've got as the whole industry is probably an ageing demographic in engineering, that you need to transfer the capabilities into the younger generation. So we'll do that, but another part of this is making sure that younger generation is also bringing new ideas and new ways of working, because we're well aware that if we do the same things we've always done, we're not going to do this in half the time and significant cost reduction. If you think about this aircraft flying for 5, 6, 7 decades, the pilots that pilot this haven't probably even been born yet. Some of them may have even just started school, but that's as far as it will go, because this will go into service in 2035 and will probably fly out well into the 2070, 2080s.
For BAE Systems and the other manufacturers working on this project, they understand just how important the Tempest is to the future of British defence.
It feels like a once-in-a-generation opportunity, and the whole team know that. The whole team know that they're working on something that is probably unprecedented. The challenges that we're trying to overcome are unprecedented, but it's really exciting, and the team feel a sense of responsibility. Yes, it's right at the cutting edge and we're trying to push it as fast as we can, but we also know there's a lot of technology that we don't even fully understand yet. So we're building it to try and future-proof it so that it's easily upgradable.
So what are those technologies they're trying to understand? One of them is actually trying to see what pilots are thinking while they fly. There are big implications.
The machine could either take over or present the information to you in a different way, or hand control back to somebody on the ground.
They are close to effectively reading minds.
What you've got in front of you is an EEG cap. So these used to be monstrously huge things, whereas now, as you can see, it's quite mobile. So the idea is that we can start to put this under the pilot's helmet and we can start to monitor them. First of all, in the lab, so we've been using it to do this task here. It essentially represents the piloting tasks. But what it allows us to do behind the scenes is up the workload level. So there's an easy level, and then we can change the difficulty of the tasks. Okay. So we get people to wear the EEG cap and the eye tracker. We've also got them wristwatches and heart rate straps, so we can get as much data as possible. And we get them to do low workload, high workload, different types of tasks.
And what will that research result in?
Ultimately in the pilot's helmet, so live during the flight we can start to see when they're getting overloaded, if they're getting stressed, things like that.
And you can't do that at the moment?
At the moment it's very much subjective opinion. It's up to the pilot what they think is going on, and data is captured in a debrief session afterwards where people discuss what happened, whereas this you can get objective data. This has got 24 channels on it that fit all over the head, and it's recording at 500 hertz. So it's a vast amount of information that can show quick changes in what's going on in the brain.
Can I try it on?
You may.
Okay, I'm sure this is going to be a great look. Okay. So is this like CCTV for the brain, essentially?
Almost. I mean, unfortunately, it's not as clear as CCTV. I mean, it's a lot of different band waves that come off and a lot of data, a lot of just numbers, essentially. So we need a lot of help trying to understand what it's actually telling us. So we're getting the data out and we're sending it to artificial AI labs and our computational engineering people to do machine learning on it. There's so much data. It's like, can we start to tell with certain accuracy whether this is high workload, whether this is low workload, so we can start to build up a picture.
How would it normally work?
This is a wet EEG, so we do actually, we'd put this on you when we're doing these sessions, and then we put gel in just to increase the conductivity between the scalp and the sessions. But you can get dry ones, so we're looking always to move towards those. The technology is just increasing at such a pace that you're always looking at the next improvement.
So the idea would be for this would be part of the uniform, essentially.
Correct.
Pilots would be used to being monitored like that. Have any of them expressed any concerns about that level of data from your brain being monitored like that?
Not necessarily. There have been jokes about having to put heavy filters in it, but essentially pilots are quite keen to understand anything they can to get that performance edge. So if they start to understand more about what they're doing and how they're doing it, or bits they may be better at than others, or they may be struggling, then they can focus their training accordingly. Also, it helps with things like in training, instead of just relying on a subjective instructor, you can get data and evidence to back it up. So if we can start to monitor what the pilot is experiencing, what mental state they're in, then Obviously, we need to let the pilot know if we were taking tasks away from them. So that's why we're looking at the human autonomy teaming. Can they work together? Can they understand more about what each other's doing? So yeah, if you start to get overloaded, so for example, when you see the videos of air crash investigations and all the alarms are going off and the pilot seemingly hasn't noticed, if we could sense that in your brain that you haven't processed that information, the machine could either take over or present the information to you in a different way or hand control back to somebody on the ground. These are all within the areas of possibility for a future fighter.
The machine takes over can be a loaded phrase. So how are they going to work out when and what it does?
A lot of the workshops we're running at the moment are very much looking at what we're calling a concept of control, of who should be in charge of what. Often people are tempted to automate things just because we can. So as human factors specialists, we're coming in and saying, no, hang on, is it something we should automate? Is there something that we still ultimately want the pilot to be responsible for and ultimately involved in those decisions? And that's what Imagine the pilot, the operator, we're even calling them, will be in the future. They'll be doing less of the flying stuff. That is stuff we know we can automate from the work we've done on UAVs. But in the future, the operator is going to be there as the decision maker. The idea is that the system will give them as much information as they possibly can, and the pilot will be there to make the decisions and have that human input there.
You're monitoring so many different parts of the brain. What else will you be capturing? What would it reveal?
Brain science, it could potentially reveal anything, but we wouldn't want to do that. We're particularly looking at mental workload for here, and that's what we're interested in. But also we've been looking at, we've been speaking with colleagues down at the RAF Centre of Aviation Medicine who are starting to look at, could it be there to detect things like hypoxia or GLOC, some more of the safety critical issues as well. So it could be used for potentially a lot of things, but that's why the ethics have to be quite tight on it of what we want to use it for. And when we're doing assessments and things like that, everything has to go through the ethics committee. So when people are taking part in the studies, that's nothing for them to worry about.
When it is precise pilots, it will have to be. That's the whole point, isn't it? That you know that pilot X
that person
is working in a particular way because of...
Yeah, and that's again the intelligent virtual assistant. Will you train together with your virtual assistant so it knows you as well as you currently know your crewmates who you go for a drink with in the bar in an evening kind of thing? How do you develop that relationship?
Tell us about Ivor.
That's the intelligent virtual assistant. So the idea is if we're going to have this human autonomy teaming, then how do we avoid that trap of what's it doing now? How are they communicating with each other? So we've got lots of ideas of how that could happen. Voice being the most obvious one, but we know that in times of high workload in the aircraft, the voice comms on the radio can often be overwhelming, and the last thing you want to do is stop and talk to the aircraft itself. You may want a different way of interacting with it. We're not going to take ways away, we're going to add different ways, so it depends on you and depends on the task you're doing, how you want to do things.
So what are the other possibilities?
The other possibilities, it could just be a straightforward Twitter feed, just a general readout of what you're doing and what's going on, who's doing what. We could do something in the HMI, the human machine interface, to show which tasks are under aircraft control, which tasks are under human control. You could almost futuristically have a 3D avatar. You could look over your shoulder and it look like there'd be a co-pilot there when there isn't in reality. And you could talk to them or talk to them as you would a traditional pilot to navigator in front to back seat.
That's how far we've come with technology.
That's how far we can do with the virtual reality, yeah. It's all possible at the moment.
And you think that that might be what Tempest does look like?
Potentially. I think one of the things we're quite keen on in Tempest is that customizability. So it's not just going to be one, you know, we're trying to use the technology so that people can use it to suit them. It's much more user-centered. Like today, everyone's phones are different. You know, your iPhone to my iPhone to whatever will all look different because we all use it in different ways. Why shouldn't a cockpit be like that? You want to make it as intuitive and as usable for each individual. So therefore, why not tailor it to how they like to use things? If you want to use the eye tracker, use the eye tracker. If you want to use the HOTAS, use the HOTAS. If you want to use voice control, use it. It's up to you. And different tasks will maybe change which things you use for what. It's that flexibility that we're trying to build in right at the start.
The big surprise about the cockpit of the future is there's nothing there.
One of the things we're looking at for Tempest is a software reconfigurable wearable cockpit, the essence of which is in our Striker helmet. Okay. So this is a Striker 2 helmet that's currently in test flight on Typhoon. You just want to pop that on. But now as you put that on, you should see in front of you your actual displays.
Yeah,
You can just be able to see the outside world. You can still see me, you can still see through it, so you will be able to see the real world outside you, but we can overlay a lot more information on top of it.
Yeah.
So information that would be traditionally shown on displays here, we can actually put outside. Because you're in the virtual world, everything's potentially display space. So if you look up above your head, for example, at the moment, you should see another display there. So it's up to you as the pilot how you set up the cockpit for what task you're doing that day.
Yeah, and I can actually, if I look up and put my hand there, my hand appears as well, so it does have that real virtual experience.
So okay, press that and then press invisible. And now look down. Now it's taking the cockpit away, so you can see underneath you.
Oh, right, wow. You almost don't believe that it's going to click or that anything's going to happen when you, because I am just pointing into thin air.
And initially people are quite sceptical. What would you do if the helmet fails? I'm going to need some real buttons, etc. But once you start talking to them and you get into the mind frame of Tempest is like an aircraft for 2035, what we're trying to do is stop the cockpit getting too cluttered, trying to keep it as clean and as easy to upgrade as possible.
Yeah.
As soon as you start to put buttons in, people will start to want to use them. So at the moment, we're very much trying to take the angle of prove to me it needs to be in there for a safety reason or for something like that. Otherwise, the idea is it would all be virtual.
So that's what they're thinking and why. How will that work for the pilots?
So what we have is the future cockpit, and I'm looking at it in a virtual reality environment. And one of the biggest features we're looking at is eye tracking. So what that allows us to do is rather than have multiple interfaces per display, we can have one set of controls and operate multiple displays with that. So I can look at an image, and wherever I look, I can zoom in and out on that specific part very quickly, very intuitively, without moving a cursor around. I can look at different buttons inside the cockpit and activate them. And I can do all this without moving my head, just with my eyes. So other than the eye tracking, we also have the ability to put our interfaces outside the cockpit. So using hand tracking, I can actually move a UI from down below up to anywhere. We also have the ability to put our UI or controls onto our hands. So you can see I can bring screens from my arm, but I can also look at my watch and get my physical state. So I can see my heart rate, I can see the time, I might be able to get my blood sugar levels and the ability to monitor my own health status.
And you can actually see your hand. I mean, does that work if I put my hand in, would that show up?
It should do, yeah.
Oh yeah, there it is. And I get a watch as well.
You should see a wand coming out of your finger, your index finger. So
oh, I see, yeah.
What our human factors team have looked at is the idea of extending the ability to look into the environment with your index finger. So now I can keep my hands nice and low, like you are, and actually point at the screen to select stuff. So what we can see here is a hologram that we've turned on. Now we're used to traditional flat interfaces. Here we're actually able to make a 3D interface. You can see I can see where I am with the white focus, and I'm able to see my other aircraft around me. I can see my fleet of UAVs ahead of me, and I can look over to the coast, see some ships, and get a sense of 3D depth now. I can look at these MES domes that we call the missile engagement zones and see that actually real 3D objects floating in front of me.
So there's nothing out of reach for a future pilot now in terms of having all the information and being able to see everything?
Absolutely. It's got 100 times more challenging because we've got so many more capabilities we can develop for, but at the same time so many more opportunities for the pilot to make things so much better for them.
So you've seen all the possibilities, but the experts have questions about the implications, including, do they need a pilot?
If you could essentially have a hologram in the cockpit with full 360 degrees, not just horizontally, but in every direction, full vision, so that a pilot could be sitting as Reaper crews are, back in a control station, not undergoing the physical stresses, then that is almost another further leap down the science fiction route, which sounds almost technically possible now. So if you were to have the hologram in the cockpit, it would do two things. Firstly, the aircraft could perform at far more extreme G-forces, because humans are a limiting factor. And then second, if the pilot is not worried about keeping the aircraft in the air because it's flying either automatically, remotely, or partially autonomously, then when it comes to the operational weapons aspect, the pilot will be have much more brain capacity freed up to do that, simply by having the hologram in the cockpit and having the human being sitting on the ground, not with those extra stresses upon them. I do wonder if part of the reason for putting so much effort into having a human in a cockpit is because for 100 years, since the Knights of the Air, the First World War pilots and rear crews, since they fought over the trenches in Europe, there's been this notion of the heroic aircrew pilot figure, and every chief of the air staff since then has been a pilot or aircrew, and it seems that that's part of the RAF culture. And to even discuss not having humans in the air somehow violates that norm, but I think it has to be considered, because if I was going to design for the future, I think the first thing I would take out is the human part at the front, which has got a lot of limitations on it. So I think, yes, these are not just technological, ethical, legal, and operational matters. I think there's a deep cultural aspect to that for the RAF and the counterparts in the Navy and the Army. We have seen the evolution from hand-to-hand fighting, spears, rifles, artillery. Now we have aircraft, standoff missiles, and the Reaper, and soon to have the Protector. Those are not accidents of history. Those are the things that commanders have dreamt of since time immemorial. The idea of a fair fight is an absolute red herring in war terms. Even those who fight at a disadvantage, so if you take jihadists in Syria or the Taliban recently in Afghanistan, they will also look to see where they can find advantage. So it's been reported from Libya that opposition groups are using small drones just with cameras to help target artillery. That's exactly what aircraft started doing in the First World War. It was used really before we got to the air-to-air combat and the bombing. It started off as a means of spotting targets on the ground to direct artillery fire. So now you have insurgent and other groups in Libya, Syria, and elsewhere who are beginning to use this similar technology. They will use every advantage, and that is how military technology has always developed, always evolved.
If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel.